You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Haristodoulou.
What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Haristodoulou, and today, as we do every Thursday, we're diving into picks for week number 4 of the NFL. 16 games slated for some football action, beginning with the Detroit Lions and Green Bay Packers this Thursday night. So make sure you comment down below. Give me your picks, your thoughts on this week's matchups, your thoughts on my picks. I would love to discuss with you all in the comment section down below. But beginning with game number 1, we've got ourselves the Detroit Lions heading into Green Bay to take on the Packers, as the Lions come in 1-0 in away games, with the Packers getting their first home win of the season last week in a big comeback victory over the Saints. This is a matchup that I think might get defined by injuries here. When I was looking at the injury report for both of these teams here, the Packers have a ton of players that, at least up until this Wednesday, had a lot of people not participating or were just limited in participation. Whereas the Lions, yes, there's a few guys that are scheduled to not be playing this game, but for the most part, they're going to have a very healthy roster in this matchup. Whereas with the Packers, Elton Jenkins, David Bakhtiari are guys that are listed as out. Devondre Campbell, another one of those as well, along with a few other guys. But the good news is Christian Watson and Aaron Jones both are slated to get some action here. I would assume Christian Watson's probably going to see some limited action, more so than any full-blown actual full count of reps here. But you look at what the betting odds are saying. Right now, Lions are -2 favorites on the road against the Green Bay Packers here. And two things that I'm kind of really looking at going into this matchup here is just how this Packers defense is going to fare against the Lions. When it comes to defending the rush, it's been kind of a weak point for the Packers here. They're allowing about 136 yards per game, which ranks them towards the bottom of the NFL. The Lions' bread and butter obviously is a little bit of both. I mean, they're strong in the passing game, they're strong in the running game, but it's going to look more like it's probably something where you're going to want to focus in on your ground attack here. Now, David Montgomery slated to play, paired up with Jahmyr Gibbs. Probably expect to see a bigger workload than maybe they would normally get, just because Packers defensively, especially against the pass, pretty stout unit. They're not even allowing 200 yards a game right now, and they're the top 10 in terms of passing defense in the NFL. So look forward to seeing maybe a little bit more of a wild rushing attack from the Lions. But overall, I do think the Lions feel like the favorites in this game here. And I think that we're going to see a decently scoring affair. I mean, both of these teams here are in the top half of the NFL in scoring. You're looking at about 24 points a game from the Detroit Lions, whereas you're looking at about 27 from the Packers here. And both defenses are about middle of the pack at best, averaging somewhere around like 21 points a game. Expect a good contest here, one that probably gets you close to that over, but it's sitting out at 45.5 right now. This is definitely one that I'd probably shy away from, because you could probably get this is like a 50-50 split on the over-under for me. I feel like that 45.5 number is really good for this game here, especially when you look at what these teams are both averaging on offense and allowing on defense. I'd stay away from that. I really like just going straight up with a winner here, and I like the Detroit Lions at -2. I definitely think they can win this game here, and it'll probably be a tighter contest. If you're somebody that likes Green Bay, that Packers +2 is nice, but overall, I like the Lions. Give them the W. Nice road victory against a division rival, the two teams that look like they're the really only ones that have a shot at potentially winning this NFC North division after 3 weeks of play. Next game we're diving into, moving into Sunday, the early window of games here, beginning with the first game in London. We have the Atlanta Falcons taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars here. This one starts at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time, so you're getting up bright and early on the West Coast. I believe that's 6:30 in the morning if you're on the west side of things, but a nice early morning game here. We have a Jacksonville Jaguars team that's 1-2 and really struggling right now, a team that just is not where I thought they would be after 3 weeks. I mean, granted, give them the loss against the Kansas City Chiefs, sure, not too crazy, but like losing the way they did last weekend with just the amount of mistakes that they were making offensively, I'm very shocked to see where the Jaguars are. And the most important matchup I'll be keeping an eye on in this game is mostly how this Jacksonville Jaguars run defense can handle the Atlanta Falcons. In terms of passing, Falcons have been very hit or miss, and I mean, it's closer to miss than I would say hit in some situations here, but they love to run the football. They are the 9th highest in average yards per game at 128, whereas the Jaguars, for the issues that they've had, have been pretty good against the run so far, allowing only about 84 yards a game, which is 7th best in the NFL. Both of these teams are pretty even when it comes to points per game scored, sitting somewhere around like 19 points, but the Jaguars have allowed a whopping 25 per game, putting them near the bottom of the NFL, whereas the Atlanta Falcons defense, pretty solid group. They've been able to slow down some pretty good offenses to this point, even last week in their loss to the Lions, only allowing 20 points despite the offensive inefficiencies that they were dealing with here. But the Jaguars are -3 favorites because while this is a road game for both teams, they are like the de facto London team. Now, as far as what I'm looking at in terms of the injuries here, realistically, the only thing you're looking at for Atlanta at this moment, Troy Anderson, he's not going to be playing here. Unfortunate injury to him has knocked him out for the time being. And then for the Jacksonville Jaguars, you do have a handful of guys that are on their injury report that are either limited participants and a couple guys that didn't participate on Wednesday's practice, but like Devin Lloyd, Josh Allen, you have Anton Harrison in there, Foley Fadukasi's on there. There's a decent amount of guys on their injury report to look at. And with the struggles that they've had just in terms of trying to get some wins so far this season and how healthy Atlanta is and how good their defense has really looked, I'm going to go with Atlanta on this game here. I think it's going to be a tighter contest. The over-under is set at 43.5 on this one here, and I almost kind of like the under because if Jacksonville continues to struggle, and while I'm expecting a tight Falcons win, I don't think that a high-scoring affair is super likely, especially being a travel game. You know, you're completely thrown off. I could see this one being one of the more like anemic games in terms of offense. So if you're somebody that likes over-unders, the under is kind of attractive to me. But I do like the Atlanta Falcons for the win, and at +3, that's awesome in my opinion. I'll take the points and the Falcons W here. I know that the Jaguars are technically home favorites here, but a London travel where none of these players have been on the other side of the planet since probably last season when they last played in a game overseas, if they even played a game overseas. I like the Falcons in this contest. Next, we're looking at what is probably a lot of people's game of the week here as we have the Miami Dolphins taking on the Buffalo Bills. This one I'm expecting to be a very offensive contest, mainly because right now, Miami, they are first in passing and in rushing, completely dominating teams. They are averaging a whopping 43 points per game right now due to that 70-point victory over the Denver Broncos last week. But even before that, high-scoring games in their first two affairs. Well, not so much against the Patriots, but that 70 from last week really pushing that number nice and high for them. But I will say this, one thing that'll be worth watching. Miami, for as great of a passing attack as they have had, Buffalo Bills, they're only allowing 142 yards a game. They're considered the third best passing defense in the NFL right now. Both of these teams don't really turn the ball over either. Both of them on the plus side of the turnover differential here. But with Miami being such a high-powered offense and being able to dump points on teams, you have a Bills team that is, one, good at stopping the pass. Two, they've only allowed about 12 points a game so far. They're the second best in the NFL. And they're the team that is second to the Dolphins in scoring. Whereas the Dolphins defense, for as good as the offense has been, I would say that the Dolphins defense has been like good to fine, somewhere within that range there. And they're not outstanding. They're 20th in passing yards allowed per game, 24th in rushing yards per game. So there are definitely some things to look at as far as the Dolphins defensively, but this is probably going to be a track meet. The over-under on this one is at 54, a whopping 54. I'm going to be honest with you, that is such a high number that I would probably just stay away from that. Not a big fan of it, but just something to keep in mind there. That 54 is just such a high number. But could I see this point total pushing into the 60s? If defense gets thrown out the windows with these two offenses, it's definitely possible. But I like the Dolphins. This game's in Buffalo, and the Dolphins are only plus 2.5 underdogs here. So if you're somebody who likes Miami taking the points and an upset victory, I like the Dolphins. I'll go with them for this game. Next up, we are looking at the Denver Broncos and the Chicago Bears. 2 weeks in a row that we're looking at a someone has to win type of scenario here. Two 0-3 teams, both coming off of blowout losses. I would say the Broncos probably a little bit worse than the Chicago Bears, but nobody has more just issues, whether it's on the field or off the field in press conferences or personal matters, than the Chicago Bears. And despite being at home, they are underdogs in this matchup here. I'm going to say that if you're somebody betting, I would stay clear of this game. You don't know what you're going to get out of either of these teams at this point right now. They're both a mess, and I think it's going to be an ugly contest. Injury reports aren't too large. The Broncos do have some people to keep an eye on. Frank Clark, Josie Jewell, both did not participate on Wednesday. Jerry Jeudy and Justin Simmons, also guys that have been limited in practice as well. And you have some notable names, Jalen Johnson, Eddie Jackson. As far as the secondary goes, a lot of guys just kind of either not participating or just on the injury report for the Chicago Bears as far as the secondary is concerned. But I would just say steer clear of this game. And as far as betting goes, because I don't really know how you determine a favorite when both of these teams have just looked awful. But I am going to pick the Denver Broncos to win this game just because I think for as much of the flack that Sean Payton has gotten to this point since his Denver Broncos tenure has begun, I think that they're at least somewhat organizationally a little bit more stable than where Chicago is at right now. And Sean Payton at least has a track record of success in the NFL. I don't really know if I believe in what Chicago Bears have going on right now. I don't think Bears fans really believe in what's going on over there in Chicago right now. Too much drama for me to pick the Bears, so I'm going to take the Broncos for the victory here. I would not be shocked, though, if I got this long because we're literally just picking a lesser of two evils, it feels, in this game. Next up, we're looking at the Baltimore Ravens taking on the Cleveland Browns, and this is a really interesting matchup here because both teams are 2-1. Cleveland, for what it's worth, despite the struggles they've had the last few years, typically do a really good job of playing against their division rivals at home, and with how good their defense has looked through 3 weeks so far, I definitely really like their odds in this game here. Baltimore themselves defensively have been a pretty solid unit. Both of these teams, obviously a big advantage on Cleveland's side right now, working within like the top 10 in terms of defenses in the NFL at this point. I would argue that the Cleveland Browns might even have potentially the best defense in the NFL with just how good they've looked. They're first in defensive yards per game allowed in terms of passing, and then rushing, they're second. So, I mean, there's a lot to like with Cleveland. The biggest issue with them, though, is their turnovers, and that is something I could potentially see Baltimore taking advantage of, especially because there's apparently some sort of shoulder thing going on right now with Deshaun Watson, his throwing shoulder at that, so something to keep an eye on there. But right now, the Ravens are just, I wish you could see my notes because it's like a list that is condensed so tiny because of how many injuries the Ravens are dealing with right now. I like this matchup for Baltimore, but with how many injuries they are dealing with right now and the potential for so many guys missing action, I think I'm going to have to go with Cleveland in this game here. I'm just legitimately concerned about the amount of people on this injury report here. Like, it is a mile long, and you have a lot of guys that weren't participating on Wednesday. Rashad Bateman, Odell Beckham, Justice Hill, Kyle Hamilton, Marlon Humphrey, David Ojabo, Odafe Owe, and then Ronnie Staley, Marcus Williams. There is just way too many people on that injury report that have significant roles on the Ravens team right now, and with me picking so far out in advance and not knowing as clear of what the roster is going to look like in the next couple of days, I'm going to shy away from the Ravens on this one here, and I think I'm going to go with Cleveland getting the big victory. As for betting in this one, if I was to speak my piece on any of these things, the over-under sitting at 40.5, the under feels kind of likely in this game. I could see this one being a slightly lower contest just because of, again, two really good defenses here. Ravens with so many offensive injuries I could see struggling, and I'm not super high on the Cleveland Browns offense at this very moment here, despite a solid game last week against the Titans. Beyond last week's game, I've just not been super impressed with them, so I could see something a little bit along the lines of the under here, but Cleveland's -3 favorites at home. That makes sense there. So if you like the Ravens as an upset victory, I mean, you could go for them, picking them +3 or something like that, or the +130 on the money line. But I really like, I would say, in my opinion, under on this one just kind of feels like something I could see here, where like Cleveland's coming out with like a 23-13 type victory along those lines. I could see a lower scoring affair just because of how good both these defenses are and how not high I am on the offenses at this moment, just because of where Cleveland is at and the injuries on offense for the Ravens. Next, we are looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers heading into Houston to take on the Texans, who are sitting at 1-2, coming off of a massive upset victory over the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville. I will say that was a fun game to watch, and even when I previewed that game here, I talked about how well Houston plays their division rivals. It just seems to be a thing that they have going on for them. So good for them. CJ Stroud has looked the part as quarterback one for them so far this year, and I've got to say it'll be interesting to see how they fare against the Pittsburgh Steelers, whose defense has been pretty solid. They're allowing about 23 points a game, which puts them at 19th, so they're like just below the average of the NFL, somewhere along that number. But I don't really know, just in terms of pure talent, if the Texans really match up that well against the Steelers. I have a feeling that this Steelers defense might potentially have a field day, especially with some of the injuries that we're seeing as far as the Houston Texans are dealing with here. As far as like guys on the offensive line that just did not participate, you're looking at Josh Jones and Laramie Tunsil. This is on Wednesday, that is. George Font was also limited. On top of that, Shaq Mason was also limited. And you have a decent amount of guys in the secondary that are also dealing with stuff that are limited participants as well, or were not participating. I like the Steelers in this one here. Way too many injuries, and I just think that Pittsburgh is a little bit further along in terms of talent. So I'm going to go with the Steelers on this one here. They're -3 favorites on the road in this game here, but I definitely think Pittsburgh has this one. It should be a victory for them just based off pure talent and injuries alone, but I mean, you never know. Last week I said there was no possibility that the Arizona Cardinals could wind up winning their game against the Dallas Cowboys, and they wound up winning, so I'll never say that again, but I do think it's very unlikely that Houston comes away with a win in this game here. Next, we dive into the Minnesota Vikings taking on the Carolina Panthers, as the Panthers, sitting at 0-3, take on the Minnesota Vikings that are 0-3. Like I said, we have back-to-back weeks now of teams that are just flat-out defeated. Somebody has to win, right? Well, Minnesota, Carolina, I will say this. The offense looked better for Carolina last week with Andy Dalton under center than it has so far with Bryce Young at this point. And you have to wonder if Bryce Young, still dealing with that ankle injury, although he was a full participant on Wednesday in practice, there is a potential that maybe they let him sit just a little bit longer to kind of get a view. And, there's no real rush with Carolina right now. So maybe they let him sit for a little bit longer just to really make sure he's back at 100% and let him see how Andy Dalton operates this offense for a second week. I wouldn't be too surprised to see that circumstance play out here, just because, again, there's no real rush. Bryce Young in his rookie year, you got plenty of time. You're rebuilding. There's a lot going on with them. I don't really see why risk your rookie quarterback and also maybe miss the opportunity to give him some more time to just take a step back and just kind of see how a veteran handles the whole situation. Because for however you feel about Andy Dalton, the guy's been in the league for a long time. He did have a lot of success early on in his career as far as making the playoffs are concerned. So maybe taking an extra week just to let him sit back and watch might not be a bad idea. As for the Minnesota Vikings, this is a team that should be better than 0-3, but they are just every single version of a turnover away from having a single win so far this season. I think that they are a better team offensively than the Carolina Panthers are, and I think the numbers show that as well, especially in terms of passing the football. They are the second best passing offense in the NFL compared to the 22nd of the Carolina Panthers. However, they can't really run the ball. They are 31st in the NFL right now. They stink at running the football here. Carolina themselves, a little bit better, but they're around 18th, so middle of the pack or so. The real question and thing that I'll be watching in this game here is, with all the injuries that they seem to be dealing with in Carolina, how healthy do they end up being, and how well do they do against this passing offense of the Minnesota Vikings? Because for right at this point in the season, 192 yards a game allowed through the air by the Carolina Panthers. They're the 9th best passing defense in the NFL in terms of yardage, and as far as that goes. So that is something to keep an eye on here, because if for whatever reason they're struggling to pass the football with, and this is the Minnesota Vikings I'm talking about here, if for whatever reason they are struggling to pass the football, I don't really think I can count on them to run the football effectively, despite Carolina kind of being a bit of a sand sieve right now against the running game. However, I am going to go with Minnesota because, like I said, despite the 0-3 start, if they could just stop turning the football over, they can win this game. I think that they're in a more competitive position right now than the Carolina Panthers. Panthers don't really have much to play for as far as like this season was concerned. This is obviously kind of a rebuild year. Vikings have got to win this game, so I'm going to give them the victory in this game here. This is another one of those games, though, that like in terms of betting, I would just stay away from. Not a big fan of it. Because right now the Vikings, I've picked them 3 times to win so far this season. They've let me down, and I'm doing it a 4th time. You know, they say that like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It's kind of what I'm doing right now, picking the Vikings again for the 4th week in a row. But this is a game I think they should win. But in terms of like gambling stuff, I don't like the game at all. Next matchup, we have ourselves the Indianapolis Colts sitting at a shocking 2-1 off of a massive upset victory over the Baltimore Ravens this past week. And then we have the Los Angeles Rams, who are dealing with some injury issues. And the Colts are kind of as well, but it feels like the Colts are getting healthier as the Rams are kind of in a spot of just like flux and injury at the moment, especially along the offensive line here. This is actually a pick'em game. So despite the Colts being at home, there's no favorite in this matchup here. So it's basically go with who you like more. And I'll tell you right now, the big thing that I'm looking at as far as this game is concerned is just the health of offensive line. Both Quentin Nelson and Ryan Kelly for the Colts are on the injury report right now, but it feels like we're going to get Ryan Kelly back for Indianapolis this week. And Anthony Richardson, who missed last week of the concussion, it sounds like he's good to go, and he should be able to end up playing come this Sunday, so I'm kind of expecting that. Whereas with the Rams, you had Alaric Jackson and Joseph Noteboom both get hurt in last week's contest, and it wound up leading to a really inefficient offensive performance by the Rams, and I think that is something that's worth mentioning and keeping an eye on here. You also have Puka Nacua, everyone's fantasy darling right now, who is dealing with an oblique injury. That is also something to be worth watching, because the passing attack has like basically gone through him, from Matthew Stafford to him as far as that's concerned. And one big takeaway that I really had, especially if they end up missing Noteboom or Jackson or both of them in this matchup here, the Rams that is, I don't know how they fare against the defensive front in Indianapolis that looked really, really good against the Ravens team that was also dealing with some injuries on the offensive line. I was really impressed with the Colts, especially in run defense here. The Rams have not really been able to run the football super effectively so far this season. They've basically been all about passing the football here. On top of that, they're dealing with some turnover issues. This Colts defense can be very opportunistic at times, and that's definitely something I think that is worth mentioning. I like Indianapolis in this game here, and I do think they get the victory. The over-under for this is set at 47. I kind of think that number is a little bit high, and I think I like the under on that one, to be honest with you, because both these teams are not necessarily super high-scoring teams. Like, yeah, the Colts are sitting at 25-ish points or so per game this season, whereas the Rams are sitting at 23, so, like, that gets you to 48. But both of these defenses, especially the Colts, I think that while their number is a little bit higher than where I think they're at right now, with how they looked last week and just how unsure of I am of the Colts offense at this moment, because they've been surprising me with how good they look, but they're more effective on the ground than they are through the air. Under feels kind of good for me on that game. I could be completely wrong, but under feels kind of good on me. Just saying. But give me the Indianapolis Colts. I think they get a nice victory here. Next game we're diving into, we're looking at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the New Orleans Saints, and obviously the Saints coming into this game here not minus Derek Carr, but potentially minus Derek Carr. I really don't think he's going to end up playing this week. I just feel like coming off that AC joint issue, I think he probably misses 1 week and then we go from there, but like he didn't participate on Wednesday, and that is definitely something worth keeping an eye on there. That is, especially it being his throwing shoulder, that's where you're really starting it. You're just rolling the dice having him play 1 week coming off of that injury, and it did not look good when it initially happened. And I can't imagine that Derek Carr is feeling ready to roll to throw for, 20, 30, 35 plays in that game, in this game coming up here. I think you're probably better off in the long term just giving him the week off, but that's my opinion there. What do I know? As for the actual matchup itself, though, I'm kind of banking on the idea that Derek Carr doesn't play here. So if it's Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill combination, I don't really like the Saints offense, because minus Derek Carr, they just went to a complete halt last week, wound up losing the game against the Green Bay Packers, and that is definitely something to keep an eye on going into this game here. I just felt like the offense looked very, very discombobulated minus Derek Carr, and even with Derek Carr in there, the Saints offense hasn't really been anything super crazy, but they are getting Alvin Kamara back, so that is something that could be worth keeping an eye on. However, despite the not-so-great performance against the Philadelphia Eagles in the downpour that they were dealing with in Tampa Bay last week, I do think I'm siding with the Buccaneers here. They are +3 underdogs in this game here. Obviously, New Orleans at home, they're going to be favorites here. Defense in New Orleans is also really good. They're top 10 in both rushing yards allowed and passing yards allowed. And on top of that, They're a pretty solid group as far as defense is concerned and just keeping teams out of the end zone. They're allowing just under 17 points a game. They're sixth best in the NFL. The defense is really good. But the Bucs defense themselves, pretty solid unit. They're really good at stopping the run, and I feel like that's something that if you're not going to have Derek Carr in the fold, it's probably something you're going to have to focus on as the New Orleans Saints, and that could be somewhat of an issue there. There are some injuries on both sides that are worth keeping an eye on here, more defensively for the Buccaneers, so that could be a bit of an issue because I'm looking at 6 guys here that did not participate on Wednesday, being Jamel Dean, Kalijah Cansey's in that group, Vita Vea, Devin White, and a couple other guys. So I'm a little bit concerned as far as how this defense is going to look in Tampa Bay, but if Derek Carr's not playing, based off of what we got against Green Bay last week, and I know Green Bay's defense is probably a little bit better than Tampa Bay's, we've seen some good things from the Buccaneers offensively. They have a really good roster altogether, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I don't know if the Saints can hang with the Buccaneers if maybe, they get to 21 odd points or something like that. I'm just a little bit concerned as far as the Saints are offensively. Their defense, I have no worries, but it really is just that offense. And minus Derek Carr, I'm just not super thrilled to see what the Saints are going to do in this game. So I'm going to go with Tampa Bay. I think it's a tight contest. I think it's kind of an uglier contest as well offensively for both sides because, again, Saints defense is really good. I'm not going to sit here and count out the Saints completely. This is one of those, the over-under is even set at 40.5. So, bettors aren't even expecting a ton of points in this game either. I just think that you have 2 solid defenses, one really good one in New Orleans, and just not a lot for me to like minus Derek Carr in New Orleans right now. So give me the Buccaneers. They get a nice victory here. A tight contest. I think it could be decided by 3 points, and that's what the spread's sitting at as well along those lines. Going into Washington and Philadelphia, we have the Commanders coming off of a blowout loss to the Buffalo Bills, and then we're looking at the Philadelphia Eagles, who are sitting at 3-0, continuing to find ways to win despite their offense not being nearly as pretty as it was last season. I will say this. I think we got a little bit of a reality check with the Washington Commanders this past week. While they are exciting to watch and they're clearly progressing in the right direction as a team, I think that there is still a bit of a talent differential between them and some of the upper echelon teams of the NFL. And while the Eagles, especially in the passing game, haven't been super great, they have been beating teams into submission on the ground. That offensive line and their group of running backs there, coupled with Jalen Hurts' ability to move with his legs, has just been a lethal combination. On top of that, the Eagles right now averaging 28 points a game and allowing just under 20 points a game, both top 10 numbers in the NFL, whereas the Commanders are allowing almost 29 a game, and they've barely been hanging around the 19 mark. So there's a lot that I'm just not super high on with the Commanders at this point. I think they're finding their way, but I don't know if they're quite ready to take down the Eagles. In this game, I like Philadelphia. They're -8 favorites in this, and I think that's kind of high, especially for a divisional matchup, because the defense of the Commanders is a really good group, especially that front seven. You have a very strong defensive line filled with first-round picks. They're very stout, and they're not going to bend over easily. But I do think that the Philadelphia Eagles, especially in terms of talent and the contribution of some of the younger talent you're getting over there in Philadelphia, outweighs what they have going on in Washington. So I'm going to take the Eagles in this victory here. I don't know how I feel about the -8. That's a big cover unless things really fall apart for the Washington Commanders in this game here. If you're somebody that likes maybe a tighter contest, Washington +8 is not too bad in my opinion, because I could see the Eagles maybe having a tighter contest where they win, something along the lines of 24-17 within that 8-point range. Moving into an interesting contest here. We have 2 1-2 teams and 2 1-2 teams that I don't think a lot of people expected to see start out 1-2, but we have the Cincinnati Bengals traveling into Tennessee to take on the Titans here. We have the Titans coming off of a blowout loss, and we have the Bengals coming off of a Monday night victory that was a grind of a contest here. The good news is it sounds like Joe Burrow, continuing to stay healthy, made it out of that game. He was a full participant in Wednesday's practice, which is good for him. The fact that he's not being limited sounds like he's trending in the right direction with that calf, despite aggravating it a couple of weeks ago. And beyond that, their injury report is fairly clean. Whereas when you look at the Tennessee Titans, there are some concerns to look at here. Elijah Molden did not participate on Wednesday. Peter Skoronski did not participate. On top of that, Traylon Burks and Harold Landry were also limited participants. There's a handful of injuries that are worth noting exploding. And then there's even guys that have been missing action for quite some time now in Tennessee. And I'm a little bit concerned with just the health and the direction that this Tennessee Titans team is kind of trending in right now. They've been really good defending against the run, but they're just letting people do whatever they want in the passing game. The offensive line on the Tennessee Titans right now has struggled in pass protection as well. They got slaughtered by the Cleveland Browns last week, and I don't quite know if the Tennessee Titans just offensively are going to be able to handle a defensive front by the Bengals. That's been a pretty solid group to this point here. And for what it's worth, the Bengals are 1-2, but they've had a couple of really tight contests here. I know they struggled with Cleveland in week 1, but like they could very easily be 2-1. They only lost by 3 to the Baltimore Ravens in week 2. So that is something to keep an eye on here. Bengals are also -2 favorites in this game here, which is interesting because it is in Tennessee here, but with just the state of the offense in Tennessee right now and just the absolute smashing they dealt with, I'd give advantage to Cleveland as a better defense over the Bengals, but the Bengals front seven is still a pretty good unit as well. Their linebackers are excellent in coverage. The defensive line can create and generate a lot of pressure and get to the quarterback. If the offensive line does not look better in this game here, I could see the Tennessee Titans having a lot of the same struggles they had last week, maybe not as bad, but still within that same kind of area. So I think I like Cincinnati in this victory here. Big win on the road for them, move themselves to 2-2, maybe silence some of the critics that they have going on right now. But the big test for them will just be being able to slow down Derrick Henry and that run game that they have in Tennessee, which hasn't been superb to this point in the season, but Derrick Henry being in the backfield is someone you have to account for, at least for the foreseeable future, until, we maybe hit the midpoint season and maybe he has fallen off. But right now, it is something that is worth keeping an eye on. Bengals are 30th in run defense right now in terms of yards per game, so they got to slow the run, but I think they can disrupt the pass game that they have over there in Tennessee. Next, we move into the later window of games here, and we have ourselves a West Coast matchup as we look at the Los Angeles Chargers taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. So this is where we start moving into those 4 o'clock games here. Now, as I said earlier with the Ravens here, I wish you guys could see my notes on this one because I have a very squished, condensed list of the amount of injuries that they are dealing with in LA right now. You obviously lose Mike Williams for the season last week. I believe it was an ACL tear, if I'm remembering correctly. But on top of that, when you look at this injury report for the Chargers, my God, is it long. Rashawn Slater is on there. Kenneth Murray, Khalil Mack, Corey Linsley, Eric Kendricks, Derwin James, Gerald Everett, Austin Eckler, who's been missing time. Joey Bosa is listed on there with a couple of things, a hamstring and a toe. There is a lot to be concerned about. And I mentioned Khalil Mack on this one here, and I shouldn't have. I meant to leave him off, but I kept him on there. But he was just taking rest, so don't worry about him, at least for this moment, but who knows. The injury bug has bit the Chargers and bit them hard. And I'm kind of concerned about this. However, the Raiders have not looked good to this point in the season. Jimmy Garoppolo came out of that game last week with an injury against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I am just genuinely concerned about the direction that they are heading in over there in Las Vegas. Another thing to keep in mind is you're dealing with Max Crosby right now, who is having an knee issue. You also don't have Chandler Jones, who is spouting off on social media what feels like every single day. There is just a lot going on with that organization, not nearly to the level of like what Chicago is dealing with, but they have some of those same kind of like organizational issues that are just kind of going on right now. And as somebody who does not believe in Josh McDaniels as a head coach over there, fantastic offensive coordinator, just don't know if he's cut out to be the head coach guy. I think I like the Los Angeles Chargers, especially at home in this game here. The defense has just not really been super inspiring for me over there in Las Vegas. The offense has certainly not been inspiring to me, whereas the Chargers at least have had some serious success on offense. They're coming off their first victory last week as well. They're averaging nearly 29 points a game to the 15 that the Raiders are averaging right now. Both defenses, again, are not really fantastic, but the Raiders also have a horrendous turnover differential of -7, which is second worst in the NFL. I think I'm going to go with the Chargers for the victory in this one here. They're listed at -5.5. Interesting number because it's very like in between that one possession, but also like just over a field goal range. I'm not a big fan of like the 5.5 numbers when those are on spreads here, but I could see the Chargers winning this game by a possession here, especially if Las Vegas's offense just really struggles. But it really just comes down to if the Chargers defense actually shows up, because they've not been great against the pass. They're very middle of the road as far as defending the run is concerned, but I like the Chargers in this game here. Next, we look at the Patriots taking on the Dallas Cowboys as the Cowboys come in to this game here in basically get right mode. You have the upset loss last week that I don't think anyone really saw coming against the Arizona Cardinals. A lot of people had them ranked number 1 in the NFL in power rankings. I was included in that list. And then they took a bit of a tumble coming off of that wildly, just completely unexpected loss, I guess is the best way you can put that. However, you do have a pretty good matchup against the Patriots. Now, what I think it really comes down to, though, is the health of the offensive line for the Dallas Cowboys and just how many people you have missing in this game here. As far as Wednesday's practices were concerned, Zach Martin and Tyrone Smith, both of them did not participate. Tyler Biadasz, I think is how you pronounce his last name, their center, also did not participate on Wednesday as well. Chuma Edoga is another guy that's a depth guy for the offensive line. He is also limited in participation. And then you have guys like CeeDee Lamb and DeMarcus Lawrence who were missing practice, but apparently it was just for rest things. It wasn't not injury related or anything like that. So if that's the case, good for that, but they did pop up on the injury report there. Defensively for the Patriots, you did lose Equale to the IR. Christian Barmore and Devon Godchow are also listed with injuries on the defensive line as well. Jonathan Jones dealing with an ankle issue right now. And then Cole Strange on the offensive line he's dealing with something as well. So there's like some injuries on both sides for both of these teams here that are a bit of a concern. But I really, really just look at that Dallas Cowboys offensive line because they clearly did not allow the offense to be as explosive this past week. And with going into the second week now of these injuries, you have to be wondering, with how good the Patriots defense looks, especially when it comes to rushing the passer, they've only allowed 130 yards per game through the air. And granted, you could say that number might be a little bit inflated. I don't really think inflated is the right word there. Maybe the number's deflated because they just went against the Jets this past week and their offense as far as passing the football is not pretty by any means. Maybe that number's a little bit lower than it should actually be. But Christian Gonzalez has looked really good. I think he could match up really well against CeeDee Lamb. He has really good size and athleticism to go up against a guy like CeeDee Lamb with his similar size and athleticism profile. If the defense can create fits for Dak Prescott and that passing game, the Patriots have a shot. I definitely think they have a shot. I don't know how comfortable I am with them in that shot, though, but like looking at the spread for this game being at -6.5, I wouldn't be too surprised if this game comes down to like less than a single score and we're looking at like the Cowboys escaping with a 4-point victory here. I do like Dallas in this matchup here, but for anyone that's going into betting and picking like just straight up winners here, I think there's a lot to consider between now and come Sunday. So that's one of those things where it's like, if you're planning on making a bet on that, unless you want to really get on that +6.5 for the Patriots, this is one of those things that like I would just take a lot of time, really consider all your options, keep an eye on that injury report as we go through the week, because the health of the offensive line for the Dallas Cowboys is going to be what I would consider the deciding factor for this game. Because if you're missing 3 starters on the offensive line for the Dallas Cowboys, the Patriots might be able to put them into a stranglehold and come out with like a 3-point victory or something along those lines, where the game ends up being super low scoring, very defensive. Both these defenses really, really good. I also don't know how the Patriots O-line would handle the defensive front of the Dallas Cowboys either. I mean, that's been a group that's not been super crazy as far as play is concerned, but I mean, they've been showing some improvement, I guess you could say. They held up pretty solidly against the Jets defensive front, but we all know the Dallas Cowboys, they're especially on that defensive front set, like that front 7 group of guys there, they're an absolute terror. So definitely a lot of just how do these offensive lines fare on both sides, but I would not be shocked to see the Patriots keep this game close. But I also wouldn't be shocked if, maybe the Dallas Cowboys come in with a fairly healthy group of guys. Maybe, 2 of these 3 starters end up playing and they just completely wallop the Patriots and they get exposed. This is a very weird game for me. Very weird game for me. But I am going to take the Cowboys. I think the contest ends up being maybe a little bit closer, but I would not be surprised if the Patriots get exposed in this game and wind up losing. Next, we look at the San Francisco 49ers and the Arizona Cardinals here. San Francisco sitting at 3-0. a lot of people's number one team in the NFL right now. They are personally sitting at the top of my power rankings here with the third best scoring offense and the fifth best defense in terms of points allowed per game here. There is a lot to like about the San Francisco 49ers going into this matchup here, but there are some injuries that are worth keeping an eye on here. Deebo Samuel dealing with both ribs and knee issue. Juwan Jennings dealing with a shin. Dre Greenlaw, ankle injury. All three of those guys did not participate in practice. Brandon Ayuk's been limited with a shoulder. Amory Thomas limited with a knee issue. So there are some injuries to just keep an eye on here, but the San Francisco 49ers are minus 14 favorites on here. That number is just so high. It's a divisional matchup. The Cardinals have been playing people a lot better than I think anyone anticipated here. This game, in my opinion, goes like one of two ways. Cardinals hang in there. Game's a lot closer than that 14-point spread, or the San Francisco 49ers blow them out. Now, as I learned last week, we should never deal in absolutes. There's obviously the potential upset by the Arizona Cardinals, although I think it's very unlikely that they pull out a victory here. But I don't know if going for a minus 14 spread on Arizona is super smart at this moment, just because they have been so competitive in all of their games to this point here. Whether it was beating Dallas last week, nearly beating the Giants 2 weeks ago, tight loss to the Washington Commanders in week 1. I would say don't count the Arizona Cardinals out. The Josh Dobbs hype is through the roof right now. The guy just got his very own jersey that you can buy on their website now. I don't know how I feel about minus 14 for San Francisco, but I do like them in the victory here. So give them a W. I think they come out victorious and move to 4-0 at home. But definitely a game to keep an eye on. One that I wouldn't be shocked to see end up being a little bit closer, especially considering their division rivals. Next, we look at a game that I'm actually a little bit more comfortable saying could wind up being a rout than the previous one we mentioned here, as the Kansas City Chiefs travel to New York to take on the Jets. This one in Sunday Night Football, primetime action here. You have the worst offense in the NFL in terms of points per game at right now. 14 points per game average for the Jets, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs, who just completely whacked the Chicago Bears last weekend. And on top of that, to double down on that, Kansas City Chiefs right now, fourth best defense in terms of points per game allowed, sitting at just over 13, whereas the Jets, like I said, barely scoring 14 points a game right now. There is a lot to be concerned about with that offense in New York, especially along the offensive line, and of course the conversation surrounding Zach Wilson. A lot of people ready to see him be let go or just be benched for somebody else. Trevor Siemian came in, not sure what that means for the Jets, but that is something at least worth mentioning to this point here. I do like Kansas City, though. I mean, injuries and whatnot aside, I know that Nick Bolton didn't participate in practice on Wednesday. Chris Jones was dealing with a groin thing. He was limited. Kadarius Toney was limited with a toe. But overall, I am very high on the Chiefs in this game here. Another one of those where I think it'd be very unlikely that the Jets come out with a victory in this matchup here. But you can, of course, never say never. They're only minus 9.5 favorites in Kansas City, and I think that's because, you do get the 3 points as a home favorite for the New York Jets. However, if there was a runaway game here, this one kind of feels like it might be. It depends on the weather, too. I feel like we've been getting a lot of rain up here in the Northeast, so maybe that's something that could slow down the offense of the Chiefs. Maybe that helps out and works out in the favor of the Jets defensively, but I'm just not super high on what the Jets are doing right now. It's really unfortunate the situation they're in. Give me the Kansas City Chiefs, though. I think they get a pretty handy victory in this one. And then finally, to wrap up week number 4, we're looking at Monday Night Football. I don't have any injury report stuff for you guys because obviously the Giants and the Seahawks are pushed back further into the week with the way their practices are working and everything because of the game being on Monday. But as far as the matchup goes, when I look at these two teams and break things down, this is another pick'em game here. So this is also something to keep an eye on. I think it's interesting, but I think it also has to do with just, getting 3 points as a home team for this one in the New York Giants. You look at this team offensively, the Giants, they're 31st in the NFL with only 14.3 points per game. They did have that wild game against the Arizona Cardinals, but you can take that for what you will. The 2 other games beyond that, offensively, not great. As for the Seattle Seahawks, 29 points per game forced. They have been scoring at will. Now, the other thing, though, to keep in mind here, the Seahawks defensively, not been great in terms of keeping their opponents out of the end zone and just putting points on the board. They're 29th in the NFL, averaging about 29 points a game per game allowed. So they are 29th in the NFL in points allowed, but they're also 4th in the NFL in points scored. They're both sitting pretty much around 29 on both those fronts here. However, if there's one thing that I'm really looking at here, when it comes to the run game. That's kind of the bread and butter of the Giants. I don't necessarily know what the status is going to be of Saquon Barkley. If he's not in the game, that is going to be a really big issue. If he's in the game, you at least have Saquon Barkley, but he's dealing with a high ankle sprain. I kind of feel like we might not see him again this week. That's just kind of just based off my thought process and what I feel like I know of high ankle sprains. Considering the style that he plays as a running back, I feel like there's a good potential, depending on where he is along in that recovery time, that maybe he doesn't play again this week, or if he does, he's very limited in his snap count. The Seahawks, their defensive struggles are really rooted in the passing game. They're pretty good at defending the run. They're sixth best in the NFL, actually, in terms of defending the run, allowing only 79 yards a game. So there is that to keep an eye on, depending on whether Saquon plays this game or not. And then defensively for the Giants, I mean, they don't really do anything great defensively. They're 18th in the NFL in yards per game allowed through the air, and then 29th in rushing yards, whereas the Seahawks, they're about middle of the pack or so. They're just very good at finishing drives and getting into the end zone. I'm going to go with the Seattle Seahawks in this one here. I have a really hard time believing, especially if Saquon Barkley doesn't play this game, that the Giants can come out victorious. Daniel Jones is also like 1-11 on the road, or not on the road, in primetime games. And that is also something worth noting, because when the lights are on the brightest, do you shine? Do you crumble? Whether that's a product of just, where his career was prior to now, I don't know, but I'm very, very down on the Giants at this point here. I thought they'd be a lot more competitive going into this season here, but the wide receiver core has just not really inspired me. Daniel Jones feels like he's regressing back to what he was prior to the Brian Daboll era here in New York, and I just have a lot of concerns about this team right now. Maybe they get a shock victory. Again, bettors think it's a pick 'em. I think Seattle should be able to potentially even run away with this game here, especially if they don't have Saquon Barkley in New York, but that'll be something that really decides as far as like both the over, under, and also how big of a favorite the Seattle Seahawks might end up being. I could definitely see this line moving based off the status of Saquon Barkley alone because of how big he is to the offense of the Giants. But I like Seattle in the victory for this one here, so give them the win. I think they can take this game here, move on to 3-1, and continue on in their race for the NFC West. But those are my picks for week number 4 of the NFL. I would love to hear again your thoughts and opinions. Give me your picks for this weekend's matchups. What am I getting right and wrong in mine? Is there anything maybe I didn't get to mention here that you think is worth mentioning and bringing up? I, of course, don't have all day to sit here and talk about this, so I try to fit in as much as I can in a reasonable amount of time. But that is it for me. I appreciate you all. Thank you all for watching. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.